but welcome. We're so excited to have you join us for this lunchtime climate science webinar. So we'll just give it 30 more seconds to let people filter in. Great. Well, it looks like we're slowing down, although people are still trickling in, but I will get us started because I know it's 12:05. So welcome everyone, and we are so excited for you to join us today. My name is Lauren Hurl, and I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Conservation Voters. And VCV is a statewide, nonpartisan nonprofit that works to elect pro-environment candidates, advocate for strong environmental laws, and hold lawmakers accountable using tools like our environmental scorecard. And as you can tell from what VCV does, I spend most of my time in the policy and political arenas, and everything we do depends on having a strong scientific basis for what's actually happening in the world around us and what strategies would be effective at driving any particular change we might want to see. And that's why I am so excited and honored to be joined today by two of Vermont's leading climate scientists, Dr. Lesley-Ann Dupigny-Giroux and Dr. Janel Hanrahan. Welcome. So glad to have you here. So we want to keep this pretty conversational today and driven by the questions that you're really interested in hearing from these amazing scientists we have today. So please continue to put your questions in the chat as we go, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. We are going to aim to wrap up right at 1 o'clock, so we'll get as much as possible in together during this hour. So just for the rundown today, so I'm just going to give a very high level overview of what's been happening in Vermont, more on the policy front before we get into the latest climate science. So as you all know, last fall, the Vermont legislature enacted the Global Warming Solutions Act, overturning a gubernatorial veto to put in place a set of ratcheting down climate pollution reduction targets over time, with the first target in 2025. And that legislation created a Vermont Climate Council, which was stood up this past winter. And that council is charged with creating a climate action plan for Vermont that is, how we actually hit those targets. And also embedded in that legislation was principles around ensuring that that is an equitable transition, that it spurs local economic development, that it fosters community resilience and other principles. So 5 subcommittees were created where most of that work of developing that plan is happening, focusing on different aspects of the plan. And there are going to be numerous opportunities for public engagement, which we can talk a little bit more at the end as we wrap up today. So stay tuned on that. This year, the Public Service Department is also updating the state's comprehensive energy plan. So there's also an ongoing public process actually starting as soon as next week. So you can weigh in on how we're achieving our comprehensive energy plan goals and what the future of that plan looks like. And then meanwhile, the Biden administration's American Rescue Plan Act brought an unprecedented amount of federal money to Vermont. And the legislature just adjourned on Friday, as I'm sure you know. And before they did, they included an approximately 54 million plus or minus in climate investments for the upcoming year in programs like low-income weatherization, helping people buy high-efficiency vehicles, helping low-income people access renewable energy, and more. And in that budget, the legislature also included a commitment to spend at least $250 million over the next 3 years to spur the transition to a clean energy economy and implement that climate action plan that is being developed by the Climate Council right now. And this is really a historic level of investment, which I think is a testament to the critical work of climate scientists and ringing the alarm bells for years and letting us know what's happening, and the activism that many people I know here with us today have been doing for so many years, highlighting the urgency and the opportunity in acting on climate. So thank you all. I think this is a really historic moment where we can use this one-time funding to spur a transition to a cleaner, healthier, and more equitable energy system. So that is my brief, but hopefully giving you a little bit of what's been happening on the policy front. And without further ado, As I said at the beginning, everything that we do in the policy space is underpinned by the science. And I'm so grateful for the time that two amazing scientists have made to join us today. So first, I wanted to introduce Dr. Lesley-Ann Dupigny-Giroux, who is a professor of climatology in the Department of Geography at the University of Vermont. She uses a variety of mixed methods, from remotely sensed data to statistics and historical content analysis, to explore the influence of atmospheric processes on fluvial processes and vegetated landscapes. Her work spans a number of climate hazards and severe weather, with a special focus on flooding and droughts. As the state climatologist for Vermont, she engages directly with community groups, K-12 schools, state legislators, federal and state agencies, and national climate organizations. She is the president of the American Association of State Climatologists, a fellow of the American Meteorological Society, and a fellow of the African Scientific Institute. Nationally, she's the lead author for the Northeast chapter of the 4th National Climate Assessment of the U.S. Global Change Research Program. She has served on the NOAA Science Advisory Board Climate Working Group, helping to guide climate research across the U.S. And statewide, she serves as co-chair of the state's Drought Task Force and was recently appointed to the Vermont Climate Council to contribute her expertise in climate change science to the creation of the 2021 Vermont Climate Action Plan. In 2014, she was a scholar in residence for the Sustainability Graduate Institute at Goddard College and their commencement speaker in spring 2015. Also in 2015, Dr. Dupigny-Giroux was elected a fellow of the Vermont Academy of Science and Engineering in recognition of her academic and outreach contributions to the state. Welcome. We are so grateful for your time and so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thank you for that very gracious introduction. And thank you to Joey Miller, who I think is on here, for her invitation to actually come into this space. And I'm really tickled pink to be sharing this with my dear colleague, Janel Hanrahan at Northern Vermont University at Linden. So really looking forward to our sort of pinging back and forth. We did this a few weeks ago at the Fairbanks Museum, and so I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So what I thought I'd do is to maybe just share a few slides at a very, very high level and talk a little bit about some of the climate change science. And then I do have some websites that I maybe can hopefully walk you through, just so that if you're looking for some additional resources, you know where to find them and how to find them. And I'll probably do that after Janelle's had a chance to share some of the work that she's doing at NVU. So if we pop into here, hopefully this all works just fine. Let me know if you're seeing this okay. Alrighty, so what I wanted to do is, like I said, just to provide some maybe high-level perspectives on climate change for the state. And when we're thinking about climate change, we really need to make sure that we're looking at all of the various pieces. So we're looking at our temperatures, we're looking at our precipitation, but we're also looking at things like storm tracks. And if we're getting storm tracks, that we need to bring us precipitation in the wintertime, because that has implications for a number of different sectors for us in terms of recreation, in terms of tourism. We also need to think about what happens when we produce a lot of activity from industrial processes, greenhouse gases, but also from an air quality perspective. And so if I had to pick just a couple slides to highlight the many, many moving parts and the feedbacks that are going on, this would be one that sort of allows us to see how various changes in our climate as a system then impact us as human beings and impact both the landscape, the environment, the ecosystem services that we so critically depend on, but also our human health. So it's a lot of moving stuff going on all over the place. But again, if we miss part of the puzzle, we're going to miss a piece in trying to work through and address some of that. So that's one piece. And so when we think about it, and we think about the various ways in which we can talk about climate and climate change, whether it's from an ecosystem perspective, whether it's from an ag perspective or energy, like I said, human health, looking at changes in moisture, getting wetter here in the state, but also changes in our temperature patterns. How does that influence a number of our sectors, including our transportation sector, including our critical infrastructure sector? And so these are some of the pieces that I just wanted to sort of highlight for us Again, thinking of it from a systems perspective. And then when we think about how climate changes and the ways in which we can sort of quantify that, a lot of times we think of changes in climate either from a trend perspective, so an increasing temperature, for example, or if we go far back into some of the longer term records, we can see these jumps in the record, like the geologic record. But I think one of the pieces that's critically important for us as human beings is looking at those variations and how those variations are increasing over time, because that puts a lot of stress on us as humans, but also on our systems that we have developed. And these two red lines that I've drawn here kind of show us the bounds within which we have developed and our societies have developed and really, really thrive once we're within our certain bounds. It's when we go outside of those bounds that we see things like temperature extremes or moisture extremes, droughts and floods, for example. And those sort of going back and forth, sometimes within the same year, sometimes within a couple of weeks of each other, what puts stresses on us as humans and on our systems. And so when we think about climate resilience, when we think about being resilient either as an economy, as a society, as individuals, sort of trying to keep our eye on the prize in terms of what are we looking at and why do some of these changes play out the way that they do. And so if we keep that variability piece in mind, what I'm showing you here is precipitation using an index over time. It's called the Standardized Precipitation Index. And it goes all the way back to 1895. And the browns and the reds and the yellows show the times in our 100+ year history where we've had particularly dry conditions. And then the blues and the greens and the yellows down in here show us when we have had particularly wet conditions. And so a couple things to just kind of highlight on here. The most recent part of our record shows are getting wetter and wetter over time, but interspersed in there, we still have droughts. And, we're still in a drought right now in 2021. And so when we think about the changes that we're seeing, we need to remember that we do go back and forth between these really wet conditions and having droughts. And then we have had even more extreme droughts way back in our climate history in here. And then the last thing is, if we only start looking at, let's say, 30 years or 20 years or 40 years, we're not going to see that full picture of how climate change has played out across the state over a long period of time. So having that full picture is critically important for us so that we understand a little bit of some of the things that we're seeing right now as we continue to think about how they project out into the future. So these are the resources that I'm either going to pop into the chat or to sort of like walk us through once we get to the Q&A piece. So stay tuned for that. And then I know we're going to transition to Janel right now, because both of us share this absolute love and passion for climate literacy, for science literacy, for getting understanding, for getting knowledge, for getting participation out to everybody so that we can co-create information, co-create knowledge. So Janel, I am going to pass this over to you so that you can tell us a little bit about some of the things that you have been working so hard on across in the kingdom. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point here and turn it over to you.
And maybe while you're doing that, I just want to make sure I can give Dr. Janel Hanrahan a quick introduction for everyone. So she is an associate professor and chair of atmospheric sciences at Northern Vermont University, Linden. And before starting her career at NVU, she earned her PhD in mathematics at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where she studied the effects of natural and anthropogenic climate change on the Great Lakes water levels. She also worked as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Alberta, where she conducted research on extreme rainfall under climate change to help inform the redesign of Edmonton's hydrologic infrastructure. Her current research involves the use of dynamical and statistical modeling to understand how climate change influences extreme weather. Dr. Hanrahan teaches several classes at NVU, including thermodynamics, atmospheric dynamics, and various introductory and advanced climatology courses. As the founder and director of the Climate Consensus, a department-led climate education and outreach group. Dr. Hanrahan works with students to improve climate change literacy among the general public by promoting effective dialogue between these groups. So I will hand it over to Dr. Hanrahan now. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. And thanks to Lesley-Ann for that great overview, I think, of the science specific to Vermont. I think that's really helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen as well. I just have a few slides and hopefully everyone can see this cartoon. Can we see that? Can I get a nod or a thumbs up? Got it. Okay, great. Thank you. So I like this schematic because it does a nice job of illustrating kind of this disconnect that continues to exist between scientists and the general public. And so on the right-hand side, we have a couple of people in the street just grappling with the question, is global warming really a thing? Whereas on the left-hand side is more of a picture of what scientists see at, say, national conferences. In this case, it's the American Meteorological Society conference, where we're no longer grappling with this fundamental idea of whether or not global warming is a thing, or even whether or not humans are the cause of recent warming we've seen in the last several decades. But instead, we're trying to disentangle the impacts that have happened and the impacts that we expect to see, say, over the next century or so. And that's complicated. And so there's a lot of really great research that's happening on the left-hand side. But I think this does a nice job of just showing this disconnect in these conversations that are happening between these two groups. And this is something that really struck me going all the way back 15 years ago when I first started working on my master's degree. And I first really started learning about the science of climate change. And at that time, I was struck by how settled the science is within the scientific community and how that contrasts what we hear from our politicians and other people on the streets. And I think that over the time that I've continued studying the science, this has changed a little bit. There's some amazing scientists who are really effective communicators talking about the science, like Lesley-Ann, I think, does a really, really nice job, especially talking to Vermonters, and her work on the National Climate Assessment Report is a really nice testament to some of her ability to really effectively communicate the science. But this is really not commonplace, not yet anyway, within the scientific community. So this is something that we are trying to change. Here at Northern Vermont University, here are some images of some of the work that our students have been engaging in. And this started back in 2014 when I had two students that came into my office, and they were feeling, I think, pretty frustrated in the state of the science and the lack of information and the amount of disinformation that's freely spilling out into the public. And they wanted to start to combat that. And so we started out by going into schools. So we've spoken at schools all across the state, and then we started being invited to various other events. So some of you who are attending this today may have seen some of my students doing some of this great work. And we've also been engaging a bit in some activism, which we found is actually really important for morale. And I'm happy to announce that we're expanding the work of the Climate Consensus. Right now, we have 8 universities, including NVU, on board. We have representatives from each one of those universities. This is really new work. We just started meeting about 5 months ago. And our plan is to, COVID permitting, start really getting out into the local community surrounding all of these universities come fall. And then over the winter, our hope is to expand this to start bringing more universities on board. And our goal here is to really change the culture within the sciences, kind of from the inside out. So within departments, geosciences departments, letting students know that it's okay to be engaging with the public on this topic, but more importantly, they actually have, we need to instill the sense of responsibility so that they understand that it's also part of their job once they become a scientist after earning their degrees. And then the last slide that I have here is one that I love showing. So this was one that was taken a few years ago. I've literally taken hundreds, maybe even thousands of pictures from all of our outreach work. And so I have fabulous pictures. And I think it says a lot when I say that this one continues to be my favorite. And so the story behind this one is I had approached the Climate Consensus group, a group of maybe 25 students, atmospheric sciences students in our undergraduate program, and asked them if they'd be willing to participate in a race. And at the time, most of them had never run a mile in their life. And the goal here was just to build community, kind of bring everybody together, insert this conversation about climate change where maybe it normally wouldn't be taking place. But we figured, people run for causes all the time. Why not run for climate change awareness. And we very quickly had 27 students, faculty, and staff who trained to participate in this half marathon relay in New York City. And this is the last group that came in for this relay. And Lily, who's a recent graduate, she's working on her master's now at UWM, is in the front there. And she was one of the students that had never participated in a race before. But these students were willing to do the training, they were willing to put in the hard work, and they were willing to be the faces that were in the streets that were advocating for climate change action. And so I think that this just does a really nice job of showing how much potential we have with this work. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now, and we'll bring it back to the general discussion.
Great. Thank you so much. So we had asked for some questions, which we got ahead of time, and I have been collecting the questions folks have been putting into the chat. So I think just staying kind of high level, going back to Dr. Dupigny-Giroux first, can you just highlight some takeaways of, like, from your perspective as Vermont climatologist, what are the most major implications people should be thinking about for Vermont's climate? You know, and one of our people in the chat said, kind of like worst case scenario over the next 100 years, and maybe just that can be one extreme. And then, you know, what are kind of the key takeaways though, as you're thinking about it, for what we should anticipate moving forward for Vermont?
So I would change maybe the frame of the question a little bit, because I think it's one of those multi-pronged types of approaches that we can think about in terms of planning for a worst case scenario, but at the same time trying to adapt to some of the change that we're seeing right now. So a lot of it is not an either or, it's an and excuse me, even as we try and mitigate and reduce a lot of those greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, there's a certain amount of inertia built into the system. So it's not as if things will suddenly just go back to normal, even if we stop putting things into the atmosphere. And so knowing that, and knowing that part of that is just baked in, sort of mandates us to think about how do we adapt to the changes that are still taking place, right? And so cutting down your emissions is one piece, but also adapting to what types of crops do we grow, what happens to your growing season, what happens to some of our critical sectors for, you know, fall foliage, for example. We do a lot of fishing. What are some of those things that we need to sort of keep in mind as we move forward and try to be a little bit flexible and nimble in our responses? Janelle, did you want to add any piece to that?
No, I think I like the reframing of the question for sure. I think maybe the only thing I'll add is that one of the biggest uncertainties when it comes to climate change projections here in Vermont, or really anywhere else, is not so much a lack of understanding of the sciences or limitations of our models, but instead what humans will do. So as Lesley-Ann said,
Right.
you know, it depends on how much stuff we continue to put into the atmosphere. And so do we continue on this path of business as usual, or do we exercise extreme mitigation? And so I like to think, instead of, well, what's going to happen here in Vermont, to, well, let's just, whatever that worst case scenario is, let's just make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you both. I guess, so this kind of builds on that. So somebody had asked, how different does the world look if we rapidly draw down our greenhouse gas emissions compared to status quo? So I think you were kind of speaking to that and the variability, but if there's anything you would add in that, someone had called that specific frame out. I would go to Dr. Dupigny-Giroux first.
No, I don't think I have anything additional to add to that. Like I said, because a lot of these potential for warming is already baked in, even if we stop producing everything today, there would still be that forward movement. So that's part of the reason why we need to continue to mitigate, but also adapt, because that temperature change is still going to take place.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Could somebody had asked about the just learning a little bit more about the link between climate and extreme weather events? in particular, somebody had noted that, we've kind of started seeing in the news where they're actually linking climate impacts to specific extreme weather events. And just would love to hear a little bit more about that. And I think Dr. Hanrahan, that's a particular expertise of, I think, of both of yours, but if you wanted to speak to extreme weather events and what we're seeing right now in the science. And
Sure, Lauren. Yeah, I can take a first stab at that. So there's some things that we have essentially been able to attribute to this climate change signal for some time now. So like temperature extremes, really warm temperatures, warm stretches, and also extreme precipitation and also increases in precipitation. So these are things that agree with theory. We're seeing it in our models. We're seeing it play out in real life. There's a few things that, actually a lot of things that we still are kind of like, we think it's related to climate change, but we're not quite to the point where we can kind of prove it or rule out other things. So one example of that would be hurricane strength and intensity. So hurricanes don't happen very often, especially the really strong ones. And there's quite a bit of variability in their intensity and their paths. And so because of that, it makes it harder to directly attribute changes in hurricane activity to climate change. That being said, we are now getting to this point where we're in this brand new climate system, and it's so far different from the one that we had previously, pre-industrial, that we can actually now start doing model attribution studies, which are pretty cool in that we have kind of these pretend worlds that we can play out and see what happens. And so just a quick example would be if there's a hurricane, a particularly notable hurricane that hits the Gulf or something like that, what we can do is we can run a model simulation and see how well it matches observation. And then what we can do is we can change the environment. So in other words, we can make sea surface temperatures colder. And if we do that and rerun our model and all of a sudden the hurricane is 30% weaker, then we can fairly confidently say that that hurricane was likely 30% stronger because of climate change. So those sorts of attribution studies are starting to happen more and more.
And the neat part about all of that is now 20 years later, we have so much more data, so much more information to put into the models, right? That we didn't have 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And so if that question were posed back then, we would be like, still don't know yet. But that sort of points to the need for high quality, ongoing, uninterrupted weather and climate information to put into those models so you can do those attribution studies. And that's what sort of gets us to that next level of understanding how these seemingly independent, non-connected events actually do sort of fit together. So it's an awesome question that we could only answer today and moving into the future because we have long-term records.
thank you both. So we're getting some great questions. I'll do a couple more kind of pretty sciencey, and then there's some great ones coming in also about how we're communicating it that I want to make sure we're getting to both aspects of the conversation with both of your expertise. So let's see, another one that's come in is what are your thoughts on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and maybe just more broadly the role of agriculture in climate change in Vermont, and what we can be doing in that space regarding climate change. Dr. Dupigny-Giroux, do you want to start, or you can jump in?
We both have that slightly outside of our area of expertise look going on. For certain parts of agriculture, yes, chemical and pesticides in particular, a little bit outside my area of expertise.
Okay, we can get to plenty of other questions. Okay. All right. So one was asking about, we're hearing a lot about wildfires in the West. They could happen here too. What do you know about the science of like doing more controlled burns, or what might we expect in terms of wildfires in Vermont?
Okay, wildfires in Vermont, we've seen in the past, and some of it has to do with how dry the landscape gets, how dry the atmosphere is, whether in a drought, whether in a particularly severe drought. And we actually had a wildfire alert earlier this spring when things got so dry that there was a lot of fuel, there was a lot of dryness in our soils, that the National Weather Service put out an alert for that. It's not been the first time. The last time I remember it being this particularly bad was the spring of 1998, when we went from having the ice storm. We literally went into having this particularly 18-month-long drought where we did have a lot of those events being in play. And so wildfires in Vermont, I'll tell you how dry we can get for this to occur. Back in the 1700s, our wetlands dried out to the point where we had the wetlands themselves starting to burn, the peat under the wetlands starting to burn, and that went on for a few years. We haven't seen that in the record since then, but if you want to keep in mind what a marker could be for wildfires, that would be it.
Great, thank you. All right, lots of good questions pouring in. So one question had to do with speaking about, so kind of more on the communication side, speaking about threading the needle between clearly communicating the risks of runaway climate change and avoiding the paralysis often caused by fear and uncertainty, and wondering, Dr. Hanrahan, if you could speak to how you all addressing this in your work.
Yeah, that is such a good question, I think, and such an important one. And I feel like climate scientists are always trying to walk this fine line between, hey, wake up, this is happening, and we need to do something about it, and the sense of paralysis. And the paralysis piece, I am concerned about particularly amongst our young people, because when they feel powerless and they're just learning about this and they're seeing their entire future kind of laid out on these climate change projections, it can in fact feel very paralyzing. But I also like to point out that when we're looking again at these climate change projections, there's a lot more possible futures, but I like to just think about two, kind of business as usual, extreme mitigation, and we of course figure out a way to get the carbon back out of the atmosphere. And the difference in those two futures by the time we get to the year 2100 is huge, and that has not happened. So what we've seen so far is just the very, very, very beginning of climate change. Has our climate changed? Yes, but it's continuing to change every single day, and it will continue to do so until we start to take this seriously and start to rein it in. So I think it's just really important to understand that this is very real, but the worst of it is absolutely preventable, right? That's the best part about climate change, is that we're the cause, because we can also be the solution. So in terms of how we thread that needle, I don't know for sure yet how the best way to do that. I think that that's something I'm continuing to learn right alongside of my students, but I think it's important to keep it in mind.
And I would also add too that for me, knowledge is power. And so the ability to share that knowledge and to walk alongside with whoever I'm sharing that knowledge is an absolute privilege that, I think is at the core of why do I do what I do. And I saw that paralysis a lot. Remember when we turned from 2000 to 2001, and we changed the millennium completely? I was working with some students in New York City, and they were paralyzed that they thought that all the computers would stop and they would die. And so just knowing what some of the fears are allows you to sort of like talk through the fears and help to sort of navigate that space a little bit. And the closest parallel I could think of right off the top of my head right now is the COVID pandemic. And the pandemic is also paralyzing in a sense, but how do you navigate that? And so again, I've spent the entire academic year walking with my students and saying, okay, we're in a pandemic. How are we going to navigate this on a personal level, on a class level? And I think some of the lessons learned in taking some of those lemons and making lemonade out of it is some of those pieces we can bring into this space as well.
Thank you. So one question somebody had kind of ties into in this communication realm. Are there examples, and I'll direct this one at Dr. Hanrahan, of work that's happening? So we've heard a lot about what's happening with the students, like work that's happening in local communities, especially in some of these universities look like they might have more of a variety of perspectives on the science around climate change and the politics around climate change. So just curious if you had any examples of kind of how community engagement's happening in the work that you're doing as well.
So is the question about what universities are doing or what the perspectives are within the universities, or
more how the universities are interacting with communities, like beyond just the university itself, but getting that word out to a broader population?
Yeah, so I think that's the most important part of what we do. Once we arm our students with the information, they're very well situated to be able to start talking about the science and start learning how to do that. I will say that we started presenting on the work that we were doing here at NVU, at the time Linden State College, about 6 years ago at some of these national conferences, AMS and AGU. And the reception has been just amazing. There's other universities that either want to know how we're doing what we're doing and how to get students engaged, or they're telling us about all the amazing things that they're doing too, which was part of what motivated the climate consensus and kind of bringing these universities together, knowing that we're not sitting here on an island and that other places are doing something just as cool, and we could be coming together, pooling our resources and providing just support for one another. And so this sort of thing is happening absolutely in some universities, but it's not happening in some universities as well. And in those universities where it's not happening, I just know from personal discussions with faculty and students within those departments that they want this sort of thing to happen. They just don't really know how to get it off the ground or how to get people interested in doing this work. So hopefully it's something we're going to start to see more often.
Great, thank you. All right. This might be one that I'm not sure both of your expertise, but we've got a couple questions about wood burning. So this is something, you know, as we look at the kind of policy solutions that Vermont is looking at, you know, this is being encouraged by some Vermont policies as a sustainable alternative to fossil fuels. And there's, you know, a lot of robust discussion around that. So wondering if either of you could speak at all to wood burning as a potential climate solution, concerns or good things that you would have to say about that.
I can start by taking a stab at this, although I'm not a biofuels expert by any means. I guess I can answer it just by saying what I do in my own house, which is I have a wood stove, which heats my house throughout the year. And that's very intentional because of the fact that I think that we need to get away from fossil fuels as quickly as possible. Simply because of how long it takes for it essentially to kind of come back, right? So if you chop down a tree and you burn it to heat your house for the winter, you know, it may take a decade, a couple of decades for that tree to grow back. And in that process, it takes that carbon back out of the atmosphere, which is why we consider that to be more renewable. Whereas if you're using coal, oil, or natural gas to heat your house, that is something that carbon has been locked up in that fossil fuel for millions, hundreds of millions of years. And it also takes millions of years for that to form. And so just putting it into perspective, you know, does one maybe put more carbon into the atmosphere in the short term? Yeah, that's probably the case if you're comparing something like wood to natural gas. But in my mind, it's also something that if we have enough trees growing back in the place, that it can in fact serve to take it back out.
Thank you. That's very helpful. So kind of going along with the policy solutions, let me see, I was trying to find one of our, yes, here we go. So we have one of our state reps here who was asking a question about how the legislature has been focusing a lot on greenhouse gas reduction through weatherization and electric vehicle incentives, while also looking at improving resiliency and adaptation to the climate change that we know is already coming and is going to come, as you started off. This esteemed legislator was just wondering, does this feel like it's on the right track, or is the legislature getting ahead of the Climate Council and off track with the science from your perspective? I don't know if either of you want to jump in on that.
So I think that's one of the ongoing discussions that we're having on the Vermont Climate Council right now, because there's a little bit of a moving on parallel tracks here between some of the policies that we are hearing about and learning about, and making sure that all Vermonters are being able to access various policies. And so a very deliberate effort is being made to actually engage with all Vermonters as we go through the process, so that all of the voices, all of the under-included voices, all of the voices that need to be at the table are heard, so that the solutions or the policies that are recommended are in line, in sync with actual livelihoods across the state. And I think that's the piece that is non-trivial. That's the piece that is, as we said on Monday, it needs to move at the speed of trust, which means it cannot happen next week, for example, right? Because when we engage with folks, we need to start a relationship. We need to start a dialogue so that everybody can come into a space where they can be heard. And because that's going to take a little bit of time, that's where some of the tension in terms of making sure that the policies are responsive to, or even bubble up from, all of our communities across the state. So it's a piece that we are sort of grappling with as council members, because we want to make sure that we are not doing harm or perpetuating harm. And so again, this is a long-term process, and it's a challenge because they're deadlines, but people come first. People's health comes first. People, in terms of climate change, come first. And so if we put people first, then that's what needs to actually be our sort of modus operandi.
Thank you for that. Another question we got had to do with the questionnaire called Global Weirding, and was highlighting how human-induced warming is manifesting differently in different places, and was hoping you could speak to how our actions are changing the jet streams and otherwise destabilizing things. So different places are experiencing different impacts, and the questionnaire was going on to indicate, that could be part of the challenge with the communication front of how we're, if people hear global warming and then see a different kind of impact. So just any thoughts you have on, how this global weirding is manifesting, and then how we communicate that effectively. I don't know if Dr. Hanrahan, you wanna, or jump in.
So we're all like, you go now. So I was going to say that's why I use the term climate change as opposed to global warming, because climate change encompasses all of the aspects of our Earth, atmosphere, water, vegetation system. And so when you see something like, lilacs blooming earlier, or you see something like a change in the jet stream, it's not weird or uncommon, because it's all part of how the entire system's changing, right? And so I always try to make sure we're focusing on the entire system, because it goes back to that piece that I just talked about, with getting more information, getting more observations, then you learn more about how something else that you would not have thought about changed. It's because you now are seeing that fuller picture, right? And so that ability to look at those, it looks like a bunch of all of these diagrams and arrows going, but we need to have that so that when we learn about, Arctic amplification, or we learn about blocking patterns, then it's not a big surprise, because it's all part of how that entire system is playing out.
And I'll just add to kind of this discussion, the distinction between this idea of global warming versus climate change. Global warming was dubbed that to indicate that we have more energy in our climate system today than we had yesterday, and more than the day before. And so, we as humans don't really sense energy, but we sense temperature, right? So we think about more energy being higher temperatures. But in fact, again, as Lesley-Ann put it, we have this Earth systems model, and what we continue to do is we're injecting this additional energy into this climate system. And the way that manifests itself is very complicated. So yeah, there's going to be some places that will warm up more, but there's some places that are actually going to be colder for some time. And then we have this redistribution essentially of the global energy. So we have more warming in the Arctic than we have, say, at the equator. And that in itself has the impact on jet streams and the way storms form and maintain themselves. And so this idea of global warming does not mean that it's going to be warmer one year than it was the previous year, right? So we're still going to have some years that are cooler than the previous year, but we still have more energy within our climate system. And that's just because when we talk about the global warming record, we're talking about the atmospheric temperature 6 feet above the ground all over the planet, but we're not taking into account other important components of our climate system, like the ocean and the ice and vegetation and all of those things.
Thank you both. We've gotten a couple questions on, something we hear a lot is, why should we bother? Vermont is so small. We have such a small population in the grand scheme of things. It's expensive and hard to do. So really, does it make sense for us to invest a lot of resources in addressing climate change? I'm just curious how you would both respond to that.
I'll just quickly say that, yeah, Vermont can't fix it. That's absolutely the case. But we also invested like crazy when it comes to addressing the pandemic. And we kind of showed the country that we were the little state that could when it came to addressing the pandemic. And so I think that if we can put best practices in place and kind of let the rest of the country and the rest of the world know how it can be done, then we could have a big voice in this.
And just to piggyback on that, the effects of climate change are local. And so that's where making interventions at the local level is critically important. Because if we can sort of prepare and be resilient for some of the changes that we're seeing or that we predict will be coming down the pike, that just puts us in a better stead so that we're not being reactive. And we can think of droughts, we can think of floods, tornadoes, whatever, right? But it's that resilience, that building of resilience from the individual level up through the community level, up through the state level, that's going to get us to the next sort of kicking it up a notch.
That is great responses. Thank you. Another question was, and I know we're within our last 10 minutes, so I think I'm going to ask one more question and then have both of you have one last reflection, and then I'll wrap us up with a just getting some links so people know how they can get involved. And Dr. Dupigny-Giroux, if you wanted to walk through the, go to the websites, that could be a good way to, so people know how to find some of these other, because we're not going to get to every great question that we've gotten today, unfortunately. So one question had been about what sort of adaptive practices might you recommend for extended periods of droughts interrupted by severe precipitation events, especially with respect to our working land-based economy. So I think this resilience piece and how we're going to deal with what we know is coming is a really important one. Either of you want, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking when I first moved to the state 24 years ago, one of the first things that I asked when I went into the local gardening supply was, do you have drought resistant plants? And at that time, people looked at me a little bit strangely. And I think it's not such a strange question now because we do that flip-flop. And so some of those proactive strategies in terms of either the things that we put in our garden or the types of crops that we grow, or maybe even some of the timing of some of our leisure activities. Those are the things that make us a little bit more resilient and flexible, because if all of the aspects of our system are changing, then we may not be able to enjoy all of the things that we have been enjoying traditionally. So I think part of it starts with our shifting of our mindset in terms of maybe letting go a little bit of some of the things that we've always done or changing the way that we do them, just so that we are trying to be strategic and proactive.
And I think that this will probably lead very well into the resources, because I think, Lesley-Ann, that you're going to show the National Climate Assessment. And so oftentimes I point people to the National Climate Assessment as kind of the latest and greatest and easiest to read summary. And you can look at it by region or by sector. And so I think that that's a really nice way to see what has been happening in our region, but also what we think is going to continue to happen in our region. And then also just to briefly mention that the next IPCC report is probably going to be coming out maybe Lesley-Ann, you have a better guess at this than me. It was supposed to come out this year, the first part of it, but probably early next year. And so that information will also inform the next national climate assessment, but just paying attention to that, because we do expect for some of the conclusions to be quite a bit different than what they were even in the last report.
And that's the real joy of working in this space, that there's always so much to learn and so much to share, that it just, I think that's part of the hope. I think somebody asked a question before about the paralysis and almost despair. I think knowing that there's so much more that we've learned in the last 6 months than we knew at the beginning of 2020 it sort of infuses us with that joy of learning and joy of sharing, really.
That's great. All right, so Dr. Dupigny-Giroux, could you show the resources and then any last words, and then we'll have Dr. Hanrahan do the same for her wrapping thoughts, and we will try to get people out right at 1. Thanks.
Not a problem. So I'll talk quickly here. So I have, I think, 4 resources that I wanted to share. This first one is what I call the state climate summaries. And if you Google state climate summaries, you will get to this page. These are created in support of the National Climate Assessment. And so if you select a state, you can go to Vermont, for example, and what it shows you are some of the things that we have seen in the state across itself, and some of the things that are sort of coming down the pike. So that's the first resource that I'm going to share with folks, state climate summaries. The second resource, if I can get some of this out of the way here. The second resource that I'm going to share, as Janel mentioned, is the Northeast chapter for the National Climate Assessment. So again, if you Google National Climate Assessment, Northeast chapter, and maybe my name, what you'll get is this entire chapter that walks us through changing seasonality and what that means for our livelihoods, both from a rural perspective, but also from a coastal perspective. So that's the second resource. Changes in stormwater, changes in timing of those. So that's the second resource that I want to share. The third one that I want to share is called the Climate Explorer. And in this one here, this is really cool. If you put in your zip code, I'm going to put in the zip code for Burlington. What it allows you to do is to actually get graphs of past changes at your particular zip code. And more importantly, it also allows you to get projected changes at your particular zip code. And this for me is like revolutionary. So, you can be doing it across the kingdom, you could be doing it for Bennington and so forth. And then the last resource, apart from the Climate Explorer, that I'd like to leave with you is the Climate Resilience Toolkit. And if you are a planner, if you are a town or city manager, and you want to see what are some of the tools that you can use to become more resilient to climate change, this is one of my absolute favorite resources in terms of all of the other case studies that folks might have done, things that you can think about in terms of adaptation, looking at it from an agriculture perspective, sort of learning from other folks, but seeing what else that we can bring to the table as Vermonters. And so those are 4 of the resources that I wanted to just leave us with. So I would be more than happy to pop these into the chat here as I am able.
That is great. And we will also send a follow-up email to everyone who participated today or registered with these links as well, so we can make sure people have that accessible. And Dr. Hanrahan, any last parting thoughts as we go forth and take this great knowledge you all have imparted?
I'll just say thank you to Dr. Lesley-Ann. These resources are fantastic, and I wasn't even familiar with some of these, so thank you for sharing these. I'm going to be checking these out as well. And then I guess the only thing I'll say is if you're not already familiar with the work of our students through the Climate Consensus, check out our website. It's www.theclimateconsensus.com. I can take that into the chat as well in a little bit. And And that's going to be updated soon as we move into this multi-institution network. So we're revamping the website, and then the social media accounts are also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. So just look for the Climate Consensus. And what I encourage you to do is to support these students. So if you see a post from the Climate Consensus, it's actually coming from a student. And so if you could just pop in there and say, hey, nice job, or I learned something today, that can be extremely helpful. And it can mean the difference between this upcoming scientist continuing to engage with the public or not.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both. I am so grateful for your time and for all your work that you're doing on the climate science and how we're getting the word out to people and the many different ways that you're working for our greater good on these critical issues. So thank you both. And thanks to everyone for tuning in today. Stay tuned. We'll keep you posted on how you all can stay involved as the Climate Council continues its work, and there will be quite a few public engagement opportunities in that work this summer. So stay tuned. And again, thank you all. And I hope you have a wonderful afternoon. Take care.
Thanks, Lauren. You did an awesome job with this facilitating. It just kept us going. Thank you so much.
Well, everyone had great questions. It kept it easy. So thank you all.